Thanks, everyone. Sorry, thanks everyone for staying. There's a really good talk in the other session that I would have liked to have seen myself. So I'm going to give you a talk about red knots from New Zealand with a real focus on where they're going on the migration, but also on when they are going there and what we can understand about how birds use the flyway. So we have a little bit of history to go through in terms of what we understood or understand about red knots. So we're probably all familiar with the idea. We have these two subspecies of knot in the flyway, Roger's eye that breeds in Chukotka and Pear's eye that breeds in the New Siberian Islands. And we'll often see a picture like this that shows Pear's eye from Northwest Australia and also lines coming from New Zealand generally across the range up to here, because we do have both subspecies in New Zealand, although far more Roger's eye than Pear's eye. Now, some years ago, we were doing radio tracking work in Northwest Australia, and we had lots of knots left there in May. So we had to figure out how can we have knots in May still in Australia. And when we looked at the climate on the breeding grounds, we realized that birds going to the New Siberian Islands don't need to migrate nearly as early as birds going to Chukotka. And so we expect Pear's eye to migrate considerably later than Roger's eye. And then some of the earlier work on counts done by Chris Hassel and others sort of confirmed this, that in Bohai Bay, the passage of Roger's eye was on average earlier than that of Pear's eye, but there were some interesting things tucked away in here, which was that both subspecies seemingly staged for about a similar period. And there was a suggestion that some Pear's eye may be staging quite late and for quite a short period as well. Now, this work has been followed up more recently, and we're going to come back to this paper later on in my talk. Another bit of work that was a little bit surprising was Mo Verhoeven also went to Northwest Australia to do visual assessments of migration timing of colour-banded birds, looking at the two subspecies. And what he found was that Roger's eye and Pear's eye seemingly migrated at exactly the same time. So we didn't see this difference between the two subspecies. If we come across to the New Zealand side of things, we have a fairly old picture from Adrian Regan, based mainly on metal band records, that we have the picture. This is the darker lines here we're interested in, the red knots going through Northern Australia and then up to Asia and up to Russia, and on the way back down something similar. So our expectation was that we have a stop off in Northern Australia. And we know from observations they migrate sort of mid-March through to early April. So then 2013 came along. Now, this was quite a big year for knot researchers, shall I say. New Zealand and Australian team went looking for New Zealand knots in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and they didn't find them. So that was one thing. The other thing is that Pavel Tomkovich published his tracks of 3 geolocator knots from Chukotka, 2 of which went to New Zealand. And both of those flew direct from New Zealand to the Yellow Sea in the same flight that our Godwits take, 10,000 kilometers. Which surprised a bunch of people, including me. And it sort of led to the general conclusion amongst some people that this is what New Zealand knots do, that therefore our knots are actually flying direct to the Yellow Sea. However, I didn't buy that story. And the reason I didn't buy it is because we also had examples like this. This is a New Zealand banded knot caught at Chongming on the 12th of May, weighing 90 grams. So this is a bird that's only just come in from migration in the middle of May. This hasn't come direct from New Zealand. So where has it been in between? So in 2013, we put a bunch of geolocators out on knots. This is our little study site, Manawatu Estuary down here. We only have about 100 or 120 knots there, which meant we had a chance of recapturing birds. The next summer, about 16 of those were back at the estuary and we caught half of them. And so we've analyzed these using FlightR and Geolite, and I'm not going to focus on the fine details of where we think they are because the two methods don't really agree all the time, but the general patterns become clear. So if we look at what we see, Geolite in this globe on the left and FlightR positions on the right, we have a stopover. We certainly have a stopover, either in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is this bay in Australia, or Papua New Guinea. We actually have another bit of evidence on there. We did GPS tracking of some knots in 2018. It turned out they were all immatures, but one of them went to Australia and it went to the Cape York Peninsula in the Gulf of Carpentaria, ranging over about 500 kilometers. So I think our knots probably are going to Northern Australia. From there, they travel up through China and Taiwan, while the coasts of Taiwan first, and then moving up into the Yellow Sea region. After refueling there, moving across to Russia with a few stops, not many, probably in Kamchatka in the Sea of Okhotsk. Now the return trip is generally similar, a few more stops in northern Russia, as we saw earlier on in the talks in the previous session as well. Stopping again in the Yellow Sea and China, maybe coming down the coast a little bit, and then perhaps more convincingly coming through Papua New Guinea and the Gulf of Carpentaria, and finally some birds coming across to Eastern Australia, others going direct to New Zealand. So we have a pretty good picture of where the birds are going in broad terms. But what I'd like to focus on now is when they're going there, because this is actually to me, quite interesting. So if we have a look at the northward migration and the stopover length of birds, we find that there was a huge range from one bird that stopped for about 18 days to another that went for about 64 days. And we could get the precise estimates of this from the Geolocator wet dry data. And the average here is around about 30 days. So quite a long stopover, particularly if we compare it to how long they're spending in Asia. So bear in mind that some of these birds are moving up the coast first, and the average here was less than 20 days. So if we put these together and they're on the same scale, you can sort of see that the stopover in Australia is considerably longer than the stopover in Asia, which perhaps we expect. Timetables do sort of condense on migration, but it is quite noticeable. So what I've got here is I've sort of put this together to put it into real time terms. So this is just March. These birds in dark blue are before they've left New Zealand. Yellow is flights. This is their staging period in Australia, the flight to Asia, and then their staging period or stopover period in Asia. And there's a couple of things that we pick out from this. One is that the stopover lengths are very different, 33.8 days on average in Australia and just 20 days on average in Asia. In terms of when the birds are actually migrating though, they're ordered by their migration timing, and the timing leaving for Asia, 3 of them left sort of in the middle to late April, 1 of them left in the middle of May. But I'd like you to put a line down here and point out that at this point, which is at the beginning of June, we have 1 bird still in Australia, and we have 4 birds already on the breeding grounds. So this was really quite surprising to me, but interesting. Here it is. And this bird left Australia on the 2nd of June. When they left from the Yellow Sea region, it was quite nice. We had 4 birds that headed out towards Chukotka, leaving from the middle of May to early June. And then we had this bird, that late bird, the 19th of June, took off, and this is the point at which we ran out of darkness. So we lost its position, but if you take that line forwards, it's heading straight for the New Siberian Islands. So at this point, the sort of puzzle started to fall into place a little bit. This bird was a Piers's eye rather than a Rogers eye, and Jesse Conklin confirmed this from a blood sample as well. So with that knowledge, I think this bird starts to make sense. Left New Zealand at the end of March, spent 2 months in Australia, arrived in China only on the 6th of June, and this is the southern part of China. It only arrived in the Yellow Sea on the 12th of June, and it only spent 1 week in the Yellow Sea, and not even going up to Bohai. Flew to the breeding grounds, arrived there on about the 22nd of June, and as we saw from Ken's example, I can say this wasn't a loser bird that was just really sick and late. It bred probably successfully. This is its incubation for 21 days in the middle of July. So I find this amazing. There's a bird that's in the southern hemisphere in June, still breeds successfully in July. A little bit more about the northern Yellow Sea. The geolocators lie. I think the birds are actually going further north than these show. There's some issues with analysis. Some birds were in Bohai, but the time that they were there wasn't very long. So for the Rogers eye birds, it was just 9.5 days at the least, up to 23. But this Piers's eye, as I said, only 6.8 days anywhere in the Yellow Sea itself. And that was interesting because that bird arrived on the 12th of June, and in that year, on the 13th of June, Yang Hon Yang saw 2,500 knots in Bohai Bay in breeding plumage the day after my bird turned up there, and wondered where are these from. So these could well have been birds from Australia, I think. So to summarize, we do have a stopover in Australia or Papua New Guinea. Birds move up the Chinese coast in their migration. We have some stopovers in Russia on the way north, and on the way south, they're using similar locations. In terms of timing, they spend a lot longer on stopover in Australia than they do in Asia. They're passing through late April to mid-June, so a long period across there. And as I'm highlighting, we have this bird in June that still made it to the breeding grounds. So what does this sort of mean? So one consequence or implication of this is that I think it changes our understanding of the nature of the stopovers that red knots have. Bohai Bay is still the only place documented with large numbers of red knots. But if a lot of New Zealand birds are going to the Gulf Carpentaria, this must also be a major and important staging site for them. And ironically, if you think about the duration they're spending there, their major staging site is in the southern hemisphere rather than in the northern hemisphere. And for these birds that stay a very long time and have a very short stopover in Asia, I wonder if this long staging period enables them to put on an overload of fuel that then means they can have a short stopover once they are up in Asia. We also managed to confirm some of the findings from Tamar Locke's paper, where they found evidence of very short stopovers of Piersmai knots in Bohai Bay. So they modeled 5 to 9 day stopovers. So we had about a 7-day stopover in Northern Australia, and they felt that there probably were Piersmai knots arriving after the 30th of May, and this bird didn't arrive until the 12th of June. So we confirmed both of those findings. And the final really curious bit to me is that this means that in New Zealand, we have some red knots that prepare to fly 10,000 kilometers direct, and we have other red knots that prepare not to do that, but simply to fly to Australia and then spend a month refueling there, or even longer. These are all birds of the Rogers Eye subspecies. This was curious to me until Jesse Conklin mentioned, well, Pavel's birds may actually be quite unusual. They may be a separate subpopulation. So possibly we have sort of 2 migratory morphs in New Zealand. And that is where I'll end. Thanks to everyone who's involved, including Jimmy Choi, who helped me make the flags that we put these on. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks.